Who's here?
Hello.
I need that speaker view thing. Yeah, I'm gonna only look at you.
Oh, I guess I'll do speaker view too.
Yeah.
I see Bert. Hi, Bert.
Oh, that's not who I saw the other ones today. Oh, wow. Hi, everybody. Hello, my mom. Oh, wow. Hi. Samir's here. Hi, Samir. Samir has a great book coming out, everybody, called Members Only.
So, should we get started?
Yeah, let's do it. Welcome everyone to Chevalier's Books in the Digital Sphere. I'm really grateful for your time this evening. I think silence right now is not an option, and there's really no better time to be having this discussion tonight. We're very proud to be having Ivy Pochoda here for her new novel that is just flying off the shelves, literally, figuratively. These women, it's absolutely incredible. You can read it at night. Ivy also wrote the books Wonder Valley and The Art of Disappearing. And tonight, she was joined by a very special guest, Steph Cha, who most recently published a truly phenomenal novel, Your House Will Pay, which won the LA Times Mystery Book of the Year for 2019. And if you're interested in getting a signed copy of these women, just email us at chevaliersbooks.com, chevaliersbooks@gmail.com. And I'm going to stop talking now to let these two incredible women have their discussion.
Hey, I'm Steph. I'm gonna be interviewing Ivy. Ivy, do you want to start by doing a little reading, and then I'll ask you some questions?
Yeah, totally. And for anyone who doesn't know, Steph and I live really close to each other and see each other a lot. So it's sort of weird to be doing this online. But I'm so glad to be doing it for Chevalier's because it's my local bookstore and I wish we could do it in person. And also, it's so great to do this with you, Steph, because I feel like there's a kinship between our books for some, practical reasons, but also thematic reasons. So yeah, I thought I'd read. I'm gonna read. I've lost track of where I've read what. So I thought I would read just from the beginning of the first section. There's a little interstitial introduction before that, or introduction. So you don't need to know anything. This is from a character named Dorian's perspective. And it's really strange to be reading this right now. I said this earlier at the beginning of this pandemic because I live in the neighborhood in which I write, and kind of confined here, and I walk the beat of this book all the time. But now with all this stuff going on in LA, I live on Western, which is completely boarded up and filled with the National Guard. So some of the stuff has a particular resonance. And I think this book just sort of is at a moment right before, what we're experiencing. The girls arrive after dismissal. How old are they? 15, 16, 17? Dorian's lost the ability to tell. They flood the small fish shack, spinning on the stools bolted to the floor, splaying their bodies over the counter. They've rolled the skirts of their uniforms high, revealing thigh, even a little cheek. A flash of underwear trimmed with lace. They've unbuttoned their blouses, yanked down their polos, showing bra and breast. I could get, gimme, lemme getta. The voices pile on top of one another as they wait for their food. They're loud, performing, making a big deal of their adolescent selves. Dorian checks the temperature of the oil, making sure it's hot enough that the food crisps instead of sweats. The girls are growing impatient because the world isn't moving at their speed. Soon they're trying to outdo one another with their takedowns, their bold profanities. Bitch, whore, slut. Dorian slides them iced tea, soda, and double orders of fries. The girls' voices rise, twisting and tangling. Let me tell you what this bitch got up to last weekend. Don't you dare. This bitch? Who are you calling a bitch, bitch? Like I said, this bitch went over to Ramon's place. Don't you say another word. Come on, you're proud of it. Don't tell me you're not. Or else how come first thing you did when you got home was text me and Maria all the details? Dorian shakes the grease from another batch of fries. My order ready yet? How come this shit is too slow? She dumps the fries into a styrofoam container. Bitch went down on him. Dorian drops the fryer basket, missing the grooves. Oil splatters onto her forearms. The girls are laughing, pinching each other, congratulating themselves on leaving childhood behind, leaving safety and sanity. Dorian turns, exiting the kitchen, and approaches the counter with the food. All you do is open your mouth and close your eyes. No big deal, like nothing at all. Dorian drops the fries. She reaches across the counter, her hand grasping the speaker's forearm. Leisha. The girls fall silent, their invincibility interrupted. Get your hand off me. Dorian holds firm. Leisha, she says, her voice brittle with panic. I said, get your hand off me. Leisha, Dorian says, shaking the girl's wrist to stop her talking the way she's talking. Who the fuck is Leisha? She feels a hand on her own arm, the present reaching into the past. Dorian. Willie, her helper at the fish shack, is at her side, his voice soft but firm. Dorian. Dorian's holding fast, shaking her kid back to reality. Tell this bitch to get her hand off me. Bitch. Leisha would never call her mother a bitch. Dorian lets go. Willie pulls her back to the kitchen. Easy, he says. Easy, easy, as if she's a dog that got too riled. The girls scatter, leaving their half-eaten food. The gate to the fish shack bangs behind them. Dorian can hear their voices mocking her as they hit the streets. 15 years later, nothing's going to change the fact that Leisha is still dead. Yet somehow the past keeps calling. Dorian puts her hand to her temples to settle her mind, sort imagination from reality. Still, everything remains tangled. Thanks. I could go on, but.
Oh, that's great. I really love this book. It's the writing is excellent. Just hearing you like read the dialogue too, it just flows so nicely. I think it's really, I don't know. I feel like dialogue is a skill that is like undervalued in a way, but
Overused and undervalued.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, I've known you pretty much the whole time. Yeah, the whole time you've been working on this book. So I've heard kind of like bits and pieces of like how it came about. But you know, since we have a kind of brand new audience here, I kind of want to hear about it. The first thing you told me about this book was the title, or one of the first things.
Yeah.
And can you start by like talking about that title? I mean, because now once you told me about it, I hear it that way. These women. But can you talk about that and like how this book started to form?
Sure. You know, the book had a different title for like the whole time. The first, like not the very beginning when I was working on it, I called it Western after the avenue, you know, outside my house, basically, where, you know, these women work, you know, there are a lot of prostitutes on that corridor. But, you know, I named it working title Western for like the first 6 months. And I thought it was a continuation. I'd have booked Visitation Street and Wonder Valley and their places. But then our mutual editor, Zach Wagman, was like, it's pretty unclear that Western's a place. Can you think of a new title? And I kept saying, well, it's about these women, it's about these women, it's about these women. And I thought, wow, I'm actually being dismissive of the characters in my own book. You know, I'm, you know, putting them all together into one group and just, you know, categorizing them and saying, you know, these women are a certain way and it's doing them a disservice, but it's also empowering them if I take that title and make a statement out of it. So I wanted, you know, there is no such thing as these women. There are women and each woman is an individual and each woman, you know, in the book has a unique story, each woman in the world, you know, but we can. And I thought that, you know, my weird shorthand for what I was writing about could really make a statement, especially in a world where, and I don't mean to offend any writer who's used this, where we have this sort of dead girl, dead woman industrial complex, which goes into titling and moving books off the shelves, you know. And some terrific books have girls and women in the title, but it's sort of become a thing. And I thought that this title could nod to that and also empower people who are usually powerless and don't, you know, get represented in fiction. So.
And that's kind of a large part of this project generally. I mean, the way that I kind of think about this book and that I've seen you talk about it is, you know, it's this book that's based loosely on the Grim Sleeper, who is a very, very prolific serial killer in Los Angeles.
Very.
And so, you know, in a sense, I guess it is serial killer fiction, but it kind of takes, it enters that genre from like a totally different a totally different point, and kind of inverts it so that we end up spending a lot of time with these victims. It actually reminded me a bit of The Shining Girls. Did you read that book?
Oh yeah, Lauren Buick's book. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and I love that novel, which is worth reading for people stuck at home. And if you want to buy it through Chevalier's, I'm sure that would be appreciated.
Great book.
That's a serial killer novel about a man who kills women, but it ends up being kind of about each victim and kind of saying something about like their lives and honoring them. And your book is structured in kind of a similar way, although with even less of an emphasis on the killing itself and even just the crime mystery element of it. But I really appreciated that about this book. Can you talk about the Grim Sleeper and it was that serial killer thread part of this from the beginning, or was that something that you used to kind of like hold the themes together?
Someone just popped up in the chat. I think they wanted a clarification on the title is The Shining Girls, right? The Lauren Buick book, The Shining Girls. So, I was writing Wonder Valley, which is my previous novel, and I still do, I volunteer and I teach creative writing in downtown LA in Skid Row. And Wonder Valley is set in Skid Row. And I was just kind of double checking some of the street language, not street language, but the way people talk. And I wanted just to have a recording of the way people talk in LA. And I was looking for something to watch in which I could just, I'm not going to record the people in the studio where I teach, but I stumbled across a documentary by Nick Broomfield, who's an amazing documentarian. He's made some really great political documentaries about, Afghanistan and torture and rendition and stuff. And he was on my radar. He's a very erudite Englishman. And he'd made a documentary about the Grim Sleeper, who is a serial killer who, coincidentally, when I moved to LA in 2009, it was in the paper that they were going to apprehend him. The story was unfolding in the press. And so I watched Nick Broomfield's documentary to get a sense of the way people talk, just to make sure that I had it right in my head. And in the middle of watching it, this never happens to me. I thought, I'm going to write a book about this. There was this amazing moment where, serial killer fiction is really predicated on, or anything, when you read about serial killers, there's always this moment where, they interview the neighbor or the wife, and, that person says, oh, he was so nice. I couldn't imagine him doing that. And you think, is that truly possible? Like, he murdered a whole bunch of people over a great number of years. And in the Nick Broomfield documentary, Tales of the Grim Sleeper, it turns out that's not true, because all his friends start off, saying that rather, pro forma speech. And then there's a moment where they pivot and they say, well, he did have pictures of tortured women in his car, and there was something going on in the background in his house all the time, and he made me very uncomfortable with some of the things he said about women. And I just thought, well, you knew what he was up to, or not what he was up to, but you knew there was something going on, and you let yourself be friends with this person despite that. So it's not just his friends, but everyone around this man, if his friends knew, must to a certain extent be aware of this. And I thought, Lonnie Franklin might be the single most boring person I've ever read about or seen on TV. I mean, he's kind of catatonic when you see him interviewed or in court. He doesn't really talk. But I thought, well, he's boring. And what he did is, I don't mean to trivialize his crimes and his victims, obviously, but, the crimes by nature are not particularly interesting. We only make them interesting because he evaded capture for so long. That elevates him, unfortunately, to this sort of holy murderer status, because they murdered for 15 years. We have to imagine that men who do this are some kind of criminal geniuses, to make us feel better about not apprehending them. And I thought, well, what's interesting is all the people who were in the wake of his murders and who had to live with the specter of violence around them all the time. And that's sort of where I got the initial idea for the story. I was going to take him out and focus on the people, in his, shadow, or in his sort of, or wake. And then they're mostly men in the documentary, but it was clear it was a woman's story from the get-go.
And one of the reasons that he evaded capture for so long is that he targeted Black and brown women. He targeted sex workers, kind of, and in LA, which until pretty recently LAPD referred to some of these cases as no humans involved.
No human involved, yeah.
So it's not that surprising that somebody like that was able to kind of get away with murder as long as he kept his victims within a certain class,
And he had the extra cloaking of the crack epidemic, which just allowed women of color, especially in that particular area in LA, which is a little bit south of where I live, down western, life was expendable then. It was another crack victim, crack was consuming LA at that point, in certain neighborhoods. So, his crimes got sort of swept up in that epidemic. It was not but the interesting thing is, there were two other serial killers operating at the exact same time he was, both of whom were apprehended, but he wasn't.
Oh. So in your book, the killer targets, women of, mostly women of color,
Mm-hmm.
and who are in this class of these women, and they're mostly sex workers. Some of them have drug issues,
Mm-hmm.
and they're kind of this group that are kind of disregarded. One of the main characters, Philia, who is so vibrant. I think she's such a wonderful character.
Yeah.
I mean, is somebody who is actually targeted by this killer. I don't think that's a huge spoiler. I think it's pretty.
No, I tried to hide that fact, but it's a little bit hard to talk about it. She's great, she's a survivor, and it's kind of great to know that up front.
Yeah, she's a survivor of this man, but nobody even bothers to listen to what happened to her.
She doesn't even know what happened to her.
Yeah, and had anybody kind of, what's interesting to me about this book is that, there is a police officer, there's a detective who kind of starts to look into these crimes and make the connections, but there's no kind of genius to the law enforcement side. There's no sense of this uniquely skilled detective is going to crack this incredibly enigmatic case. It's just a matter of who's going to pay attention to these people?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not, as you know, because you know me, I'm no expert in, policing and police procedural, and I'm not going to write a true procedural novel about the cops, because there's enough people who do that and do that very, very well. And I don't want to throw my hat in that ring. I'm definitely more interested in the periphery of a crime than the actual, investigation. But as I said earlier, these serial killers aren't smart. They just somehow get away with it. It's not like no one sets out to be a serial killer. You kill and then you get away with it, and it's in your nature to do it again. You do it. We have this, there's so many people who write about this quite eloquently, but there aren't, real Patrick Batemans or Hannibal Lecters or, Dexters. I mean, the trope of the serial killer who kills serial killers is something that I think needs to be retired. Because we like serial killers so much, we need to have one who kills legitimately to make us feel better about our fascination with serial killers. It's sick. I really think it is sick. In the same way that I don't believe in the myth of the genius serial killer, I also don't believe in the myth of the genius cop who's set out, task with this, high IQ profiling. Yes, profiling is, it's actually controversial on some aspects, but it's not always the answer. I mean, if you read something like I'll Be Gone in the Dark by, Michelle McNamara, is that Michelle McNamara, right? Yeah. You see how even with all of the force of technology and profiling and geoprofiling and DNA profiling and everything, they can't catch this rather average guy who's been killing for 35 years. So you can't have that. In my mind, there is no genius to meet genius. There's just reality to meet reality. And it really is exactly what you said. It's a question of someone paying attention to what's important, which is the victims, not this guy, because he's not important, And
I think also, something that, watching the news over the last week, it's been obvious too, so a lot of law enforcement is also kind of there's a triage approach where you prioritize the crimes that are likely to get solved, yes, but also that you want to solve.
Right.
And I think part of the problem with the Grim Sleeper case is, probably how much did those lives matter, right?
Yeah.
Were they going to how many resources were they going to allocate to doing that?
None.
Yeah, and I think that's very telling. You know, and as long as we're talking about kind of policing, and there was actually a New York Times op-ed today about the role of kind of crime writers and crime fiction in reinforcing kind of the ideas we have around police and law enforcement. And full disclosure, I gave a couple quotes for this piece.
I didn't read that. Who wrote that?
John Fram. He is
Yeah.
an author who has a novel coming out in July called Bright Lands.
Bright Lands, yeah.
But you know, I read plenty of police procedural type fiction. I mean, it's just kind of such a cornerstone of the genre. Actually, I've been listening to audiobooks, and without really knowing what it was about, I started listening to Mystic River, and you know, one of those main characters is a police detective, you know, and it's kind of interesting listening to a book that has a police officer as one of its protagonists, you know, with everything that's going on out, like right outside the door. You know, I feel kind of like, you know, and I've thought about this a lot, like how our genre kind of depends on the solving of cases, the smooth functioning of the justice system in a way has to be background to to whole subgenres of crime fiction. And I was wondering, you know, because you don't usually write about police, but in this book you have one character who is a point of view character who is a police officer, who's a detective. And I also happen to know that you didn't initially want to have a detective as one of your main characters. So can you talk about your experience writing about police in this book? You know, that's new to you?
Yes, I can tell everyone else, but clearly you know the answer to this question. You know, as I said earlier, like, I'm not in the crime genre I'm not good at that stuff. Like, it doesn't come naturally to me, nor is it my primary interest to like investigate exactly how the nuts and bolts of an investigation would unfold. And you know, there are people who do that miraculously and marvelously, and who take that to very important places. You know, and it's just not my interest, and it's not my job. And I'm really reticent to write about cops and, you know, reporters, which I know a little bit more about, and, you know, PIs. You know, it's just not something that I feel like I can do well. I had written the first draft of this book, not entirely, not all the way through. It's written for people who haven't read it in blocks. So we followed Dorian, who owns a fish shack, whose daughter was an earlier victim of the serial killer. And then we follow a young woman named Juliana, who is a potential victim. So, and we follow each story to its completion, and they sort of add up. So I written 3 of these blocks, and I gave it to Steph and I have a mutual editor. And he said, you know, it's not my job to make suggestions, but I think you need a cop character. You know, you have a cop in the book. I had a male cop who sort of came and went. He said, I really think it'd be interesting if you wrote a cop and had a female cop. And I thought, you know, that's just not going to work for me. I just can't do that. Because it will feel very formulaic, and, you know, it'll feel like I'm trying something in the genre with which I'm not comfortable, just to satisfy, you know, conventions of crime fiction. And we talked a lot about it. And in the course of the conversation, I realized what he was suggesting was that if I had a female cop, she could get involved in situations with the various women in the book and have conversations that they wouldn't be able to have with a male police officer. And then I realized that when I was going to write from her perspective, it didn't need to be about the case. It needed to be about her experience. And as a woman in the world that she lives in, her experience is a different shade of gray from the rest of the women in the book. She's a woman in a difficult world where she's not being listened to, she's not being believed, she's not being trusted. So just like the victim of a serial killer who's not to be trusted with the facts of what actually happened to her, my police detective, Esmeralda Perry, also is always being questioned in the force for everything she does. You know, I mean, yeah, I'm female, obviously, and I live in this world, and, you know, I'm as an ex-professional athlete, and just, you know, the questions I would get: did you string your rackets right? Did you bring enough balls to the courts? Like, you don't ask a male athlete if you did that. So I was able to draw on my experience, just like existing in the world, to sort of have my female cop as the drive through the novel, that's what she's dealing with. It's not the investigation, it's her existence, which mirrors the existence of these women. See, that's why it's a good title, of these women. And then so I didn't have to write about the nuts and bolts. I could use her experience as another manifestation of, what I'm trying to explore. So when I was able to come up with that idea, I was able to write a female detective. And I've had this discussion with Megan Abbott, because we both have the same issue with writing detectives. And she said when she wrote Give Me Your Hand, which is a book about science, she knew nothing about science. But when she realized that the issues in the lab were similar to the issues anywhere else, it didn't really matter what was going on in the lab, like with beakers and, animal dissection, or, it was more that the gender dynamics were the same no matter what. And once you understand that, you can sort of let go and write about whatever milieu you need.
So you have six, do you have 6 point of view characters, or is it 7?
6. Thank you for saying 6. Most people say 5 and ignore Philia, and it makes me a little crazy.
I was trying to remember if Philia made it 7 or 6.
Philia makes it 6, thanks.
Okay. So you have 6 point of view characters, and they all kind of have their own voice. Philia we hear from in the first person. Mm-hmm. Everybody else is in the third person. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So I'm wondering, was Philia's voice the one that came to you first? I just asked because that's the most clearly voicey one, but they each have their own kind of voices and styles of narration. And I was wondering, who came first to you and got things going?
Juliana, she is my favorite character to write. She's the sort of fast woman who's sort of towing between the straight, non-sex working world and, trying to figure out how much of herself it lives in the sort of is a sex worker, and how much of her is still holding on to the straight world. Her voice was so easy for me to write. Philia came from out of that conversation, that difficult conversation with my editor about having to write a detective. I was really against it initially, and I said, I'm going to do exactly the opposite thing. I'm going to blow this book open and write in the first person from someone who doesn't contribute to the story in the same way. I'm going to go reverse course, nothing conventional, no detective. I'm going to write a very aggressive, opinionated. I was so mad because it's something I didn't want to do. And then from that, I got Philia's voice, and then I sort of calmed down and wrote the detective. And also, I've been told in grad school that you can't have a book in the first and third person, which is, something that is just absolute bullshit.
I've heard that rule.
Yeah, I mean, I neither have I. Frankly, it's showing off and it's difficult. And I just thought, well, I'm going to do it and screw you all. So it was a fun thing to do. Also, I know many people listening are writers, and when you don't know what you're doing, just do something else. And that's how Philia came, was just, and there's a character in the there's a person, Pamela Brown, in the Nick Broomfield documentary, which is really, really important watching. She's an ex-prostitute who takes Nick Broomfield around South LA, and she's really intelligent, beyond intelligent, but she's sort of, she's a ex-prostitute with a felony rap sheet, so she can't get a job. And she obviously, can't participate in the kind of society we think is, the one that allows you to have a voice. But she's so brilliant and interesting and astute that I kind of wanted to nod to her in the book. So that was sort of Philia. So
half of your point of view characters are white women and half are women of color, I think, right? It's 3 and 3.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And a lot of your characters are sex workers, and and this is something that I've dealt with because I'm an Asian American woman. I am not kind of in the weeds on a lot of the stuff that I write about. And you're writing from a similar position, one of kind of privilege and power. And I think it's something that I thought about a lot as I was writing Your House Will Pay. And I was wondering when you were writing these women, and also Visitation Street and Wonder Valley, I know that the Wonder Valley, a lot of it took place on Skid Row. How do you approach writing because I know my answers, but how do you approach kind of writing from that position about people who have less power than you, who are more marginalized than you are, and kind of doing it in a way that is respectful without being totally just like, ooh, I'm going to keep my hands clean?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And, you know, it's just different with every book. When I wrote Visitation Street, I wrote a book about my neighborhood and I just didn't even think about it. You know, in order to represent the neighborhood in Brooklyn where I was living at the time, it just wasn't even, it wasn't even a question that the story had to be told from the perspective of the neighborhood is very much divided down the middle, black and white, and like there's no one answer to what the neighborhood is. So in order to create, it was a book that turned out apparently to be a mystery, but I thought it was sort of a study of this neighborhood, which it is. And I had a, you know, there was a guy who I used to hang out with at the bar named Boozer, not because he drank a lot, and he's works at the he works at the prison in Brooklyn, the jail, the Brooklyn House of Detention, which doesn't exist. Well, we closed briefly. I think it's back open. I wanted to write from his perspective, and then obviously because he was such an interesting person in the neighborhood, and it wasn't. And then the person in the neighborhood who was most interesting to me was the Lebanese bodega owner who I talked to every day, maybe 3 times a day, who watched the neighborhood wake up and watched it go to bed at 1 in the morning. And when the book came out, no one had asked me this question. And it took a while for someone to ask. They said, well, how daring was it to like write about like the Lebanese bodega owner? And I said, oh no, it's really interesting. He's great. I did make a weird mistake. I called him Fadi because that's the name of his bodega, but it turns out his real name is Cliff, which made me like very sort of, so I gave Cliff your book and I thought, oh, Fadi was his dad. So, you know, I didn't think about it the first time. And in Wonder Valley, I didn't think about it so much either because it was based on, you know, my experience in Skid Row, and I used characters from Wonder Valley in there. So I was familiar with the Black character in Wonder Valley as someone I'd written about. In this book, I was very conscious about it. Also because I knew what you had been doing in Your House Will Pay, to be honest. Like I knew your sort of, some of your considerations. I'm very committed to my work in Skid Row, and I know a lot of women who work in the sex profession, and I respect them. Like, it doesn't make a difference to me what they do. I try not to make their stories sensational. I don't think about, you know, it's funny, if you think too hard about it, you make a big deal out of it, and it becomes bigger than it is. I try to be as organic as possible in the process. And I try to tell a slice of the story, which is something I understand, without making the whole, like I can't reach into the world. I don't know the whole world. I don't know everything about the characters I write about. And it's not my job to look at all of the, you know, societal implications and biases. I can only look at the story that I've placed these women in. So I feel if I focus on that story and draw on the voices that I hear and know and who I have a direct relationship with, I feel quite confident in it. And so far, you know, it seems to have, you know, no one seems to have taken exception to it. But the more I think about it, the harder it becomes. It's like gymnastics. When you're looking at that vault at the end and you're like, I'm running as fast as I can towards this vault, it's really dangerous. I think it's becoming harder for me. I was very, you know, Dorian is white. Her daughter was killed. Her husband was Black. So her daughter was, you know, mixed race. And I had to do it that way. You know, I just could not write, it was too many steps. I couldn't write a Black grieving mother. It just felt uncomfortable, but I could write a white grieving mother, you know, in this world. So I try to figure out how to balance these issues. What's your answer?
I mean, I think kind of, I approached it very consciously, and I think that's what worked for me, was like, I knew what I was doing, I knew the pitfalls, and I spent a lot of time kind of approaching my work in progress from the position of a very harsh critic, somebody who was reading for I just, in my mind, I was thinking, okay, what would I roll my eyes on if I just
Yeah.
had to eyes on this and I were just a reader who was kind of, because I tend to be critical as I read other people's work too,
Oh,
and I'm pretty sensitive.
sure you are.
Yeah, I'm pretty sensitive to kind of, anytime a character is flattened for any reason. And so I kind of edited with these things in mind. I mean, I think as long as you kind of fade the tropes and you approach your characters with respect and treat them like full, well-rounded people rather than making them angelic or flat in any way. I think because that's another pitfall I think of some writers who write across racial lines is kind of sanctifying your characters too. I think that can be almost as bad as just reducing them into other types of stereotypes. But I think it's just something that I've always been conscious of.
Yeah.
But I will say that on this side of things, with the book having been published and your book has been published, I think for all the grief that we heard about American Dirt, which happened this year. American Dirt was this calendar year. It's crazy. But for all the controversy surrounding that book, I have found that readers are a very understanding, forgiving bunch as long as you do your job. And so I think that's a big part of it. It's just like you do your job. A lot of that boils down to talent, but a lot of it is just care. Right?
I mean, that's the tricky answer to that question too. It's like, I'm pretty good at what I do and I love voices, I love stories, and I'm a really good listener. And, I've worked, I've taught creative writing in so many different places, and I'm a huge eavesdropper, and I love stories and I love interrogating people. It makes my husband crazy. I'll talk to anyone for any length of time about anything. And, these stories become a part of me, but I also am very aware that certain people don't have much more to give than their story, so you can't abuse it, So if you're going to sort of borrow from somebody's story whose life is, much more difficult than yours, you better damn well respect that story and do a good, honor it, and also make sure that you're not stealing it for your own benefit, but to sort of, shine a light into a place that might traditionally be overlooked. So.
One of the big themes of these women is the role of art and the artist. Juliana. I know.
Thank you, stealing.
Juliana is kind of an artist who is starting to think of herself as an artist, and then there's like a white woman artist who's in this much more comfortable position where she is able to kind of exhibit her art.
Yeah.
Without giving too much away, there's some overlap between these characters. I think it's hard to read a book about art by an artist I know and not kind of look for the self-referential in it. But I wanted to ask you to talk about that kind of the role of art in your book and if it kind of mirrored any of your thoughts about like your role in telling these stories.
The story didn't really come from too much personal experience. So Giuliano, she has this quasi-prostitute. She's an exotic dancer, but she is a great photographer who uses her iPhone to photograph, but because she, is Latina and, might be a sex worker by someone else's definition, not hers exactly, her art will never be, even if it's amazing, it will never be shown. I am painfully aware of our fetishization of the kind of photographs she takes. There are some really great artists who take them. Larry Sultan, who is a terrific, now deceased photographer who shot an amazing series of photographs about porn stars between takes, trying to capture their lives between takes. It's not at all denigrating, and he's white, but he wanted to humanize the work and show these moments. But then you look at Vice magazine and the work of that sleazebag Terry Richardson, who really glorifies drugs and, sex and violence, and not quite violence, but just it's disgusting what he does. But he's super famous and he's paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this. And like, in my mind, Giuliana's a better photographer. And I was sort of interested in, if you look at Vice magazine, which, sadly I do, and, lots of these sort of there's this passion for these visceral sort of fashion shoots where everyone looks one step away from nodding off after like an OxyContin overdose. And, but it's just staged. And why, but Juliana has a great eye on her world, and she's showing the humanizing she's trying to humanize the work of the women that she hangs out with. But we don't consider it art. But if a white woman like Morella in my story, who is a visual artist, and she's not terrible, she's a video artist. It's an art form that I have some issues with, because like I feel I've been to a lot of art school exhibitions of video art, and it's always a little bit challenging for me to appreciate it. She doesn't have a good voice. She's not a bad artist, but she doesn't have a story to tell, but people are going to listen to her. My husband went to film school, and he's white. He went to Harvard. He really stayed in his lane in terms of the stories that he felt comfortable telling. But there are a lot of people from the same background who would go to Tijuana and like make stories about abortion clinics or border crossing, and the school just loved it. And it felt very uncomfortable to have to witness that, white people telling border crossing stories, and getting a lot of money for it and acclaim. It's a little bit different now, but I sort of wanted to address why we wouldn't accept the real art about these subjects, like someone who's on the ground level, but why we kind of love this sort of sanitized, watered down version of it. I hope my book is not that, but I'm sure it isn't. But I am sort of always, I like this poverty porn that seems to have, we have an insatiable, as much as we have an insatiable appetite for intelligent serial killers, we have beautiful poverty porn. For everything that I think does a good job, like the Florida Project, there's something, or Tangerine, like indie movies like that, there's just another movie that just sort of treads into that landmine and doesn't succeed. So I wanted to sort of address those issues, because it is sort of a commentary a little bit on the book, though. I'm not going to go there.
I had a journalist character in my book that I get asked about all the time, and it's like, oh, somehow without my realizing it, like a lot of the anxieties that I had about like writing the story I was writing kind of got shoehorned into this character.
I know, it's a little bit, I mean, it's a little odd. I think about Morella, not so much her art, but this idea, I live in the neighborhood I write about. My daughter's growing up here, and I love it. And I'm very much adamant that she experienced everything in the neighborhood. We're not scared of anything, but we don't know our neighbors. There's a fence between our houses. We have very different lifestyles. We know our neighbors, we just don't know the family next door, and they have kids who are my daughter's age. They're Korean. They are very afraid of the neighborhood. They don't go out, and they don't participate in the block events. We invited our Christmas parties. They're very nice. They just don't come. And I just love the idea, and this is sort of Morella's character is dealing with, of these two lives, one's neither right or wrong, but two people growing up like literally 50 feet or 10 feet from each other and having completely different experiences of a place. And that's sort of what I wanted her to touch on. Her parents don't like where she grows up, but I just kind of thought, our neighbors are clearly, rightfully, they have the reasons to be sort of a bit on edge, and they do everything they drive out in the mornings, and they have a gate, and they close it, and everything's very shut down. And so Morella's parents are similar to that. And I was sort of interested in the idea that, of living somewhere but not participating in it.
Okay, so it's 7:47, so I wanted to open it up if anyone else had questions for Ivy. Otherwise, we can just keep talking. But if anyone has questions, feel free to pipe up or type in the chat.
Yeah, if you want to, there's a little icon at the bottom of your screen where you can raise your hand, just so we don't have people talking over each other. I can unmute you, or you can put in the chat, or just wave your arms if you have your video on.
I'll ask a question. Hi, that was great. I really love noir. I love detective stories, and I live on 20th Street, and Chabalita says at the end.
Oh my God, I walk down your block literally every day.
I know, so we'll have to meet up. I live on the corner of Gramercy, and so I know a lot. I've lived in West Adams for a long time, and I know a lot about, where you live in Harvard Heights, and it's really great. So the sense of place. I'm really looking forward to reading your book to get the sense of place that I think you're going to represent. I'm really psyched about that.
Oh, I'm so glad. You know, I served at the UNNC, the United Neighborhood Council, for until I had to drop it because we traveled too much. For my husband kept working in New York, so we had to go back. So I love this neighborhood. I'm interested to know people's reactions to the book because everyone in the book has an issue with the neighborhood, though I don't. You know, they're very honest about it. So this isn't the book that boosts the neighborhood, but I think the overall picture is very positive. I'm interested to know what people think because you could read it as sort of, you know, disparaging, but I think that it's actually a quite honest and beautiful and positive take on it. But I'm really curious because I know there are going to be some people who say, you know, Dorian, after the part that I didn't read, she leaves the fish shack and walks up Western and talks about, she understands why people don't want to live in West Adams, which is the way I feel. Of Harvard Heights, like I totally get why people don't want to live here. It's the reason I want to live here, you know, but I love your blog.
Yeah, it's a really great block, and we have a pretty solid neighborhood situation. And so as I say, I'm really looking forward to the sense of place. And when I saw a book about West Adams set in West Adams, I was really psyched about it. So thank you, and I look forward to it. And also that you're from the East Coast, I'm from Boston also. Okay. So it's really an interesting thing to experience, you know, all of this. And so thanks.
All right. If people, Bert.
Unmute. I'm unmuted. Thank you. Ivy and Steph, thank you for doing this. It was really fabulous. As I listened to you and learned a little bit about your background from your presentation, I wondered, is the story that you tell in your book one that could only have occurred in Los Angeles in your experience?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, I don't know because I'm not familiar with every city, but let me think. You know, I think it could definitely have I was watching some of that really good documentary on HBO about the Atlanta child murders and some of the same issues with policing and negligence for a certain type of victim, because that's the jumping off point for the story. The book itself, the setting is definitely very Los Angeles, but the negligence towards investigating crimes of a certain type of victim, I think, is sadly universal. I think we're probably going to see that more as in time. Like, I think we're going to see this type of story told about meth and opiate overdoses, which is going to be more of a white story in like middle America. And I think it could be set anywhere. My version of it is definitely a 100% Los Angeles book, but I think overall, you know, women of color and their death has been overlooked throughout the country. That wasn't the answer I wanted to give, but I realize that probably is the correct one.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Ivy, I know you wrote about this for the LA Times, but how's your quarantine experience been?
You know, I'm very lucky to live in LA in a house with a yard, so I'm not going off the wall. This week was the week I sort of realized I needed to get out. It's been okay, but I think more this last week with sort of the protests and stuff, it sort of changed the nature of quarantine and makes you feel a little more helpless, or I'm ready not to be in quarantine. I mean, really, I was okay for a while, but yeah, I don't know. How's your, Steph has a new baby, which is not the most interesting thing to say about any writer, and you shouldn't say it, but Steph's quarantine is probably a little different than the average person's.
I'd say it's probably superior.
Yeah,
I mean, or at least I feel like giving birth and going to the hospital, like that was worse, but being in quarantine with a newborn is great because I'd be kind of locked down anyway. But I have felt this past week, especially, you know, I feel like under normal circumstances, if we weren't quarantined, if I didn't have a newborn, you know, I'd kind of be like at some of these protests, particularly the ones that are like in my neighborhood. I live
I know.
I mean, and I have been watching the news and feeling just kind of everything is surreal and feeling just very separate from the city, and it makes me miss LA. It makes me kind of mad, but I'm also just like inside, haven't been outside in weeks, and like holding like a lovely newborn. So this whole thing has been like very bizarre.
I drove down Western today, which is sort of where we live. And I mean, I drive around a bit and walk a ton, but I hadn't, it's surreal. I don't know if you've been there. The Western's boarded up. It's being all the Koreatown Plaza, the Galleria, they're all boarded up, graffiti everywhere, National Guard troops. And with the quarantine, it really feels apocalyptic. You know, it's a really odd feeling. It feels like, it's surreal. It doesn't feel like the city. It feels empty and I don't know. Oh, there's a question. Oh, hi. I know you. Oh, wow. I wish I knew the answer to that question, but the question says, perhaps this is going off topic, but if there's a question of resources available to investigate all homicides, do you have any opinions about allocating those resources? I don't really, you know, I don't know too much about the actual police funding. I know that thankfully we're going to have less police funding next year, which is definitely a step in the right direction, though hopefully that won't mean that cases that should not be investigated, should be investigated, will not be. There's an amazing book by Jill Levy.
I was just thinking about that.
Levy or Leovy? I can't say it.
I don't know. It's spelled
Yeah.
Levy.
Levy. It's Leovy. Jill Levy.
I think there might be another E in there. No, actually,
no, it's Leovy.
Okay,
right? It's called Ghetto Side, and it's really, I mean, that's the book, if you want to know this, you should read. That's where, you know, no human involved is sort of the calling cri de coeur for a lot of the cops in South LA and Vermont Harbor. She's a journalist who wrote about these matters, and it's a really important book.
And actually, one of the things that she talks about in that book is about how homicides, kind of the big violent crimes, are not investigated and solved, whereas so there's under policing for some crime and there's over policing for kind of like lifestyle crime,
right.
You know, the broken windows policing, and how those two things put together create this terrible environment for the people who live there and this deep distrust of law enforcement. And I think, I don't know, I was just talking to my husband about like how a lot of police work is actually social work, and how if police were recruited with the upfront expectation that a lot of what they're going to do is social work, and you know, if maybe they didn't show up for social work armed, you know, things might be better. And also, you know, when we're looking at like a city budget, if some of the resources of the police department were allocated towards like actual social work, you know, social workers being paid a lot less than cops, you know, that might be a massive improvement for the city. But again,
yeah, I mean, nowhere is this more obvious than in South LA and Skid Row, whereas, you know, I actually posted about this on Facebook today. You know, they arrest people on Skid Row who don't require or deserve being arrested, but who need help. But that doesn't exist. Like finding someone, you know, on the street with a crack pipe, that's a crime, but clearly that person's not a criminal, you know, so we don't have that level of, you know, civil social services, and hopefully that will change.
does anyone have like a last question? We're getting towards 8 o'clock.
You guys should all buy Steph's book if you haven't. That's my final salvo here. It's called Your House Will Pay. It hasn't appeared over on that chat to the group, but it's incredible. And it's I hate the word timely. It's one of my least favorite words when describing fiction, but it's timely. It just like happens to be. It's timely, and it's really, really good.
Well,
I second that.
Oh, thank you. Well, I will give one last plug for These Women, which is a truly amazing novel. I mean, I've loved your last 3 books, and I say that because your first one is the one I haven't read. But I love your books. I think These Women is my favorite.
Oh,
it's just really wonderful, and it stays with you. I read it kind of at the beginning of quarantine, and
remember.
And I've been plugging it. But well, thank you everyone for showing
Chevaliers.
up on,
And you guys, Chevaliers is going to be open for appointment browsing. I heard today when I showed up there to sign some books. So stop by. It's mine and Steph's local neighborhood bookstore, and it's my favorite in LA. So please check it out.
yes, please support Chevaliers.
Yes, please.
Amazon does not need your money.
Hopefully the National Guard won't be patrolling Chevaliers as it was this morning.
And
Oh,
thank you so
you're
much,
welcome.
Steph and Ivy. We really appreciate you being here with us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Goodbye to my parents who I don't get to see in person, but I know are on here somewhere. I love you all.